The sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as Katherine Evans clutched her bonnet against the relentless wind. The year was 1876, and she had lost everything except her determination and the clothes on her back. The banking collapse in Philadelphia had taken her family's fortune. Her fiancé had abandoned her upon hearing the news, and now she was headed west to claim her late uncle's homestead, her last hope for a future. The journey had been arduous. 3 weeks by train to Denver, then 2 days by stagecoach to the small settlement of Whitetail Creek, Colorado. Now she faced the final leg, a day's ride through open country to reach her uncle's property in the foothills. The stagecoach driver had refused to take her further, claiming the route was too dangerous for his schedule. "Miss, I strongly advise hiring an escort," the station master had told her that morning. "There's been trouble with bandits along that trail, not to mention wolves and other dangers." Katherine had counted her remaining coins barely enough for supplies, let alone hiring protection. "I'll manage," she'd said with more conviction than she felt. But as she struggled to control her borrowed mare on the rocky path, Katherine's confidence waned. The vastness of the landscape both awed and terrified her. Rolling plains stretched before her, with mountains looming in the distance. The emptiness made her feel insignificant, a speck of dust against the enormous canvas of the west. When her horse suddenly reared at a rattlesnake crossing the trail, Katherine nearly tumbled from the saddle. She managed to stay mounted, but her map fluttered away on the wind. "No," she cried, watching helplessly as her only guide disappeared into the tall grass. Panic rose in her chest. Without that map, she had no idea which fork in the trail would lead to her uncle's homestead. The afternoon was advancing, and she knew being stranded after dark could be fatal. That's when she heard it, the steady rhythm of hooves approaching from behind. Katherine turned to see a lone rider coming toward her. Her heart hammered. Friend or foe? In these parts there was no way to know. The stranger rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, its coat gleaming in the sunlight. The man himself was tall, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. A rifle was secured to his saddle, and he wore a gun belt with practiced ease. His duster coat was weathered from years under the open sky. He slowed as he approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Seems you've lost something." Katherine straightened her spine, summoning what dignity she could. "My map, yes. I'm trying to reach the Evans homestead near Crystal Creek." The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Finally, he nodded once. "I know the place." Old Robert Evans spread. "He was my uncle," Katherine said. The stranger considered this information, then gestured to the trail ahead. "I can show you the way. It's not safe for a woman to ride alone in these parts." Katherine hesitated. Every story she'd heard about the West included warnings about trusting strangers, but as the sun inched closer to the horizon, she knew she had little choice. "I would appreciate the assistance, Mr. Adams, Jackson Adams." He touched the brim of his hat. "Most folks just call me Jax." "Katherine Evans." She offered a small nod. "I'm grateful for your help, Mr. Adams." Without another word, he turned his horse and began riding slowly enough for her to follow. His silence was striking, not uncomfortable, but noticeable. Here was a man who didn't feel the need to fill the air with idle chatter. As they rode, Katherine studied his broad shoulders and the confident way he sat in the saddle. There was something reassuring about his presence, despite his obvious familiarity with weapons and the wilderness. He seemed to belong to this untamed land in a way she feared she never would. "Have you lived in this territory long?" she ventured after nearly an hour of silence. Jax glanced back at her. "Since '68, After the war, Katherine nodded, understanding his brevity. Many men who had fought in the Civil War spoke little of those dark years. And the Evans homestead, she pressed, needing information about what awaited her. Do you know it well? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, I helped your uncle build his barn 3 summers ago. Good man. Kept to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. I never met him, Katherine admitted. He and my father had a falling out before I was born. When we received word of his passing last winter, along with the deed to his property. She trailed off, not wanting to reveal too much about her desperate circumstances. Jack simply nodded, seemingly understanding what she didn't say. They rode for hours, the landscape gradually changing as they approached the foothills. The grassy plains gave way to scattered pine trees and rocky outcroppings. The air grew cooler as the elevation increased. Katherine's body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. Just as she was about to ask how much further, Jax raised his hand, signaling her to stop. He dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to a nearby tree. We'll rest here. Horses need water. Katherine gratefully slid from her saddle, her legs nearly buckling as they touched the ground. Jax pretended not to notice her awkwardness, busying himself with leading the horses to a small stream that flowed nearby. Thank you, she said when he returned, offering her a canteen. He nodded, then moved to gather wood for a small fire. Katherine watched him work, his movements efficient and practiced. As the flames caught and grew, she eased herself down on a fallen log, stretching her sore muscles. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. Jax looked up from the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. For the first time, she could see his features clearly, strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble, straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer storm. Your uncle helped me once, he said simply. I owe him. How did he help you? Katherine couldn't stop herself from asking, though she suspected this man wasn't accustomed to sharing personal stories. Jax poked at the fire with a stick, seemingly focused on the flames. Just when she thought he wouldn't answer, he spoke. Winter of '71. Bad blizzard caught me in the high country. Your uncle found me half frozen, brought me to his cabin. He paused. Stayed there 2 weeks until the trails cleared. Never asked for payment, just help with chores. It was the longest speech she'd heard from him, and Katherine treasured this glimpse into her unknown uncle's character. That sounds like the man my father described before their disagreement, kind but practical. Jax nodded, then stood. I'll check the perimeter. You should eat something. He disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Katherine alone with her thoughts. She retrieved some jerky and hardtack from her saddlebag, eating mechanically while contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. 3 months ago, she had been preparing for a June wedding to William Harrington, the son of her father's business partner. She had been fitting for gowns and planning a honeymoon to Niagara Falls. Now, she was sitting beside a campfire in the Colorado wilderness, her only companion a taciturn cowboy who knew more about her uncle than she did. When Jax returned, he carried more firewood and some wild onions. Without a word, he prepared a simple stew using provisions from his saddlebag. The savory aroma made Katherine realize how tired she was of jerky and hardtack. Where did you learn to cook? She asked as he handed her a tin cup of the steaming mixture. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Army taught me to cook. Life taught me to cook better. They ate in companionable silence, the night sounds of the wilderness surrounding them. Coyotes called in the distance, and the wind whispered through the pines. Despite the strangeness of her circumstances, Katherine felt oddly at peace. We should reach your uncle's place by mid-afternoon tomorrow, Jack said as he cleaned his cup with sand from the stream bed. Trail gets steeper from here. Is it habitable? Katherine asked, voicing one of her greatest fears. The lawyer who sent the deed wasn't certain of its condition. Jax considered her question. Solid build. Roof needed work when I saw it last. Has good water and grazing land. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was honest. Katherine appreciated that. Thank you. Not just for the information, but for everything today. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. He nodded once, then spread his bedroll on one side of the fire. You should sleep, Miss Evans. Take my bedroll. I'll keep watch. Surely you need rest too, Katherine protested. Used to sleeping light, he replied, settling himself against a tree trunk, his rifle across his knees. Katherine wanted to argue but could feel exhaustion tugging at her. Wake me if you need to rest, she insisted, though she suspected he wouldn't. As she laid down, wrapping herself in his blanket that smelled of leather and pine, Katherine studied the cowboy across the dying fire. In Philadelphia, men like William had talked endlessly about politics, business ventures, social engagements, yet said very little of substance. Jackson Adams spoke rarely, but there was weight to his words, truth in his silences. She fell asleep wondering what other truths those silences held. Dawn arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the soft nickering of horses. Katherine awoke to find Jax already up, tending a small fire with coffee brewing. Her body protested as she sat up, muscles sore from yesterday's ride. Morning, he said, offering her a cup of strong black coffee. Good morning, she replied, accepting the cup gratefully. Did you sleep at all? He shrugged, which she took as a no. Despite this, he appeared alert and ready for the day's journey. Katherine envied his resilience. They broke camp efficiently, Jax handling most tasks while Katherine tried to make herself useful despite her inexperience. Within half an hour they were back on the trail, climbing steadily into more rugged terrain. The day grew warmer as the sun rose higher. The trail narrowed in places, forcing them to ride single file. During these stretches, Katherine studied Jax's straight back, the way he constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. She felt safe in his presence, protected in a way she'd never experienced before. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a stand of aspen trees. As Katherine stretched her legs, Jax suddenly tensed, his hand moving to his sidearm. What is it? She whispered, alarmed by his reaction. Riders, he said tersely. Get behind me. 3 mounted men appeared on the ridge above them. Even from a distance, Katherine could see they were rough-looking, unshaven, with firearms prominently displayed. Well, look what we have here, the leader called out as they approached. Jax Adams and a lady friend. Don't often see you with company, Adams. Holt, Jax acknowledged coolly. We're just passing through. The man called Holt grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Passing through our territory, that'll cost you a toll. Katherine felt a chill despite the warm day. These men were trouble, the kind of bandits the station master had warned her about. There's no toll, Holt. This is open country, Jax replied, his voice level but with an edge of steel. Maybe we'll take the lady as payment, one of the other men suggested with a leering glance at Katherine. She saw Jax's shoulders tense, though his expression remained impassive. She's under my protection, he stated simply, but the words carried an unmistakable threat. Holt studied them for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. 3 against 1 were good odds, but something in Jax's demeanor suggested he wouldn't be an easy target. Where you headed? Holt finally asked. Evans' homestead, Jax answered. This seemed to surprise the bandits. Old Robert's place. Heard he died last winter. His niece is claiming the property, Jax said, nodding slightly toward Katherine without taking his eyes off the men. Holt laughed harshly. "Good luck with that, lady. That place is cursed. Indians attacked it twice. Last time nearly burned it to the ground." Catherine's heart sank at this news, but she kept her face composed. "We'll be on our way now," Jack said firmly, his hand still resting near his gun. For a tense moment, Katherine thought the men would refuse, forcing a confrontation. Then Holt shrugged. "Your funeral. That place ain't worth dying for." He jerked his head at his companions, and they rode off, casting backward glances that suggested they might return. When they were out of sight, Katherine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jack simply nodded, then checked his horse's saddle. "We should move. They might come back with more men." They rode hard for the next hour, taking a different path than originally planned. Jax explained it was longer but less likely to be watched by Holt and his gang. Katherine didn't question his decision, trusting his knowledge of the territory. As they rode, Katherine found herself wondering about his history with the bandits. There had been recognition there, perhaps even an old grudge. She wanted to ask, but sensed it was better not to pry. The sun was beginning its descent when Jax finally slowed their pace. "There," he said, pointing to a clearing ahead. "That's the Evans homestead." Katherine leaned forward eagerly, getting her first glimpse of what was now her property and her future. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, backed by tall pines with a view of distant mountains. A small stream ran nearby, and meadows suitable for grazing stretched to the east. The structure itself was modest, a one-story log cabin with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A barn stood to one side, and the remains of what might have been a garden plot were visible. But Holt hadn't been lying about the attack. Part of the roof was blackened from fire, and one window was boarded up. The corral fence had collapsed in places, and weeds had overtaken what once had been a path to the door. Katherine's heart sank as she surveyed the disrepair, but she fought to keep disappointment from her face. This was her inheritance, her only option. She would make it work. Jax watched her reaction carefully. "It's solid underneath," he offered, perhaps seeing her dismay. "Needs work, but the foundation is good." Katherine nodded, grateful for his attempt at encouragement. "Then that's where I'll start." They rode the final distance to the cabin. Jax dismounted first, quickly scanning the area before helping Katherine down from her horse. His hands were strong and calloused as they spanned her waist, setting her gently on the ground. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she stepped back quickly, flustered by her reaction. If Jax noticed her discomfort, he gave no sign. He moved to inspect the cabin, checking windows and the structural integrity of the porch. "Stay here," he instructed before drawing his gun and entering the cabin. Katherine waited anxiously until he reappeared in the doorway. "It's clear," he reported. "Animals got in through that broken window, but nothing worse." Relief flooded through her. At least she wouldn't have to face human squatters on her first night. Jax helped her unload her meager belongings from the horse, then set about securing the animals in what remained of the corral. Katherine stepped tentatively into what was now her home. The interior was simple but functional. A large hearth dominated one wall with a rough-hewn table and chairs in the center. A bed frame stood in one corner, its mattress long gone. Shelves lined the walls, some still holding preserved goods and tools. A ladder led to a small loft space. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but Katherine could see the potential beneath the neglect. She was still exploring when Jax entered with firewood. Without a word, he began building a fire in the hearth. As the flames caught and grew, light filled the dim cabin, making it instantly more welcoming. "There's a root cellar out back," he said, straightening. "Might still have some preserved food. I'll check before I go." Katherine turned to him in alarm. "You're leaving? Tonight?" He studied her face, his expression softening slightly. "Need to get the horses somewhere safe before dark. Wolves in these parts," understanding dawned. "Of course. I didn't think." "I'll be back at first light," he added. "Bring supplies from town." Relief washed over her. He wasn't abandoning her completely. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Adams." He nodded, then moved toward the door. "Bar this behind me. Don't open it for anyone else." "Will those men Holt and his gang return?" she asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Jax paused. "Not likely tonight. They prefer easier targets." It wasn't entirely reassuring, but Katherine appreciated his honesty. "Thank you again for your help. I don't know how I can repay you." He shook his head slightly. "No debt between us." With that, he was gone, the sound of his horses' hooves gradually fading into the distance. Katherine barred the door as instructed, then turned to face her new home. The task before her was daunting. The cabin needed extensive repairs, the land required cultivation, and she had almost no experience with either. In Philadelphia, servants had handled such matters. Here, everything depended on her own two hands. But as the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, Katherine felt a strange sense of possibility. This place was hers. No social obligations, no disappointed father, no faithless fiancé. Just her, this cabin, and the vast wilderness outside. She found a broom in a corner and began sweeping, raising clouds of dust, but gradually revealing the solid wooden floor beneath. She worked until her arms ached, then cleared enough space on the floor near the fire to lay out her bedroll. As she sat wrapped in her blanket, eating the last of her provisions and listening to the night sounds outside, Katherine realized she was, for the first time in months, looking forward to tomorrow. True to his word, Jax returned at dawn, his horse loaded with supplies. Katherine had risen early, washing her face in the stream and attempting to make herself presentable. When she heard hoofbeats approaching, she hurried outside, surprised by how pleased she was to see him. Jax dismounted, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze on its forehead. "Brought you a horse," he said by way of greeting. "The one you were riding needs to go back to the livery." Katherine stared at the animal in surprise. "You purchased a horse for me." "Traded for it," he corrected. "Old friend owed me a favor." Before she could thank him, he began unloading supplies. Tools, food staples, seeds, even a mattress tied with rope. "Mr. Adams, this is too much," she protested as he carried the items to the porch. He paused, looking at her directly. "Winter comes early in the mountains. You'll need these things to survive." The blunt assessment silenced her objections. He was right, of course. She had arrived woefully unprepared for the realities of frontier life. "Then I am in your debt," she said simply. Something flickered across his face, perhaps surprise at her acceptance. He nodded once, then continued unloading. As they worked together throughout the morning, Katherine learned more about her silent companion through observation than conversation. He moved with purpose and efficiency, never wasting motion or words. When she asked questions about the cabin or the land, he answered concisely but thoroughly. When she attempted personal inquiries, he deflected them gently or answered with such brevity that it discouraged follow-up. By midday, they had organized the supplies and Jax had repaired the broken window with materials he'd brought. Katherine prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon, which they ate on the porch, watching clouds build over the distant mountains. "Storm coming," Jax observed, his eyes on the darkening western sky. Katherine followed his gaze. "Will it reach us today?" He shook his head. "Tomorrow, likely. Need to fix that roof before it hits." "The roof?" Katherine looked up at the fire-damaged section with dismay. She hadn't even considered how to address such a major repair. "I don't know how to fix a roof," she admitted. Jack studied her for a moment, then set down his plate. "I'll show you." The next hours were a revelation for Katherine. Jax wasn't talkative, but he was an excellent teacher. He demonstrated each step of the repair process, then watched patiently as she attempted to mimic his actions. He corrected her techniques without condescension, his calloused hands occasionally guiding hers to show the proper grip on a tool or the right angle for a cut. By sunset, they had replaced the damaged roof section with fresh shingles. Katherine was filthy, exhausted, and prouder than she'd ever been in her life. She had helped repair her own roof, something she would have considered impossible just days ago. As they washed up at the stream in the fading light, Katherine found herself studying Jax's profile. "Where will you go after this?" she asked impulsively. He glanced at her, water droplets clinging to his beard. "Got work waiting at the Henderson Ranch. Cattle drive starts next week." "Oh." Katherine felt an unexpected disappointment. "How far is that from here?" "Half-day's ride. Southwest." He stood, drying his hands on his pants. "You'll need more repairs before winter. Root cellar needs reinforcing. Chimney could use pointing." Katherine nodded, recognizing his way of changing the subject. "Will you have time to show me those things too, before your cattle drive?" Jax seemed to consider this request carefully. "Could come back after my chores. Day after tomorrow." "I would appreciate that very much," Katherine said, unable to hide her relief. That evening they moved the repaired mattress into the cabin and set up a proper bed in the corner. Jax showed Katherine how to bank the fire to last through the night, then prepared to leave. "You're not staying?" she asked, surprised. He shook his head. "Not proper," he said simply. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. Of course, a single woman and man sharing a cabin would cause scandal, even in these remote parts. "Where will you sleep?" "Got a camp set up by the stream, close enough if you need help." She nodded, touched by his consideration both for her safety and her reputation. "Good night then, Mr. Adams, and thank you again." He touched the brim of his hat and slipped out into the darkness. Katherine barred the door behind him, then prepared for bed. As she lay on the newly stuffed mattress, listening to the wind in the pines, she found herself thinking about the cowboy who had so unexpectedly entered her life. There was something compelling about his quiet strength, his competence, his integrity. In Philadelphia, she had known many wealthy, educated men, but none who could build a roof, track a path through wilderness, or stand unflinching against armed bandits. She fell asleep wondering what had shaped Jackson Adams into the man he was today, and why the thought of his eventual departure left her feeling so bereft. The next morning, Katherine woke to the smell of coffee. She dressed quickly and found Jax on the porch, 2 steaming cups beside him as he worked on mending a broken chair from the cabin. "Good morning," she greeted him, accepting the cup he offered. "You're here early." "Storm's moving faster than expected," he replied, nodding toward the mountains where dark clouds were gathering. "Wanted to check the roof before it hits." They spent the morning securing the cabin against the coming weather. Jax showed Katherine how to chink gaps in the log walls with a mixture of mud and grass, while he repaired the stone chimney. By the time the first fat raindrops began to fall, the cabin was weathertight. "Should hold," Jax said as they retreated inside, the rain now falling steadily. "Might last a couple days, this kind of storm." Katherine looked at him in alarm. "Will you be able to return to your camp?" He shook his head. "Too dangerous in lightning. If it's proper, I can sleep in the barn." "Of course," Katherine agreed, though the barn was hardly more than a shell after the fire damage. "But you should eat with me at least." "I insist." For a moment she thought he might refuse. Then he nodded once, removing his hat as he stepped fully into the cabin. The storm intensified throughout the afternoon, rain lashing the windows and thunder rolling across the mountains. Katherine found herself grateful for the weather that kept Jax nearby, even as guilt nagged at her for such thoughts. He had his own life, his own responsibilities. She couldn't expect him to continue helping her indefinitely. Yet as they sat before the fire that evening, sharing a simple stew Katherine had prepared, she couldn't deny the contentment she felt in his company. His silences were comfortable rather than awkward, and when he did speak, his words had substance. "How did you come to be in Colorado?" she asked as they finished their meal. "You mentioned the war." Jack set down his spoon, gazing into the fire. For a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Served with the Union cavalry. After Appomattox, couldn't go home to Kentucky. Too many ghosts." He paused. "Headed west. Worked cattle drives, scouted for the army sometimes, ended up here." Katherine absorbed this rare glimpse into his past. "Do you ever miss your home?" A shadow crossed his face. "Home burned during the war, family scattered or dead, nothing to miss anymore." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, struck Katherine deeply. Here was a man who had lost everything yet continued forward, building a life piece by piece in this harsh territory. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shrugged slightly. "Long time ago now." "Is that why you helped my uncle?" she asked. "Because you understood loss?" Jax looked at her then, really looked at her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "Maybe. Never thought about it that way." Thunder crashed overhead, making Katherine jump. Jax rose, checking that the windows were secure against the driving rain. "Should check the barn," he said, reaching for his coat. "Be careful," Katherine urged as he headed for the door. "It's a terrible storm." He paused, glancing back at her, a hint of something like warmth in his expression. "Been through worse." After he left, Katherine cleared away their dinner things, then stoked the fire. The cabin felt empty without Jax's solid presence, despite the roaring storm that seemed to surround her on all sides. She hoped the barn would provide adequate shelter for him, especially if the storm continued through the night as predicted. When a particularly violent thunderclap shook the cabin, followed by the sound of something heavy falling nearby, Katherine hurried to the window. In the brief illumination of lightning, she saw that part of the barn roof had collapsed. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and unbarred the door. The rain hit her like a physical force as she ran toward the barn, calling Jax's name. She found him inside, attempting to move his horse away from the damaged section. Water poured through the new hole in the roof, already turning the dirt floor to mud. "Are you hurt?" she shouted over the storm's fury. He shook his head, leading the nervous horse toward her. "Need to get him to shelter." Together, they managed to bring both horses to a lean-to attached to the cabin, a woodshed that offered better protection than the compromised barn. By the time they finished, they were both drenched to the skin and shivering in the unexpected cold the storm had brought. Inside the cabin, Katherine stoked the fire to a blaze while Jax stood awkwardly near the door, water pooling at his feet. "You need dry clothes," she said practically. "I have a blanket you can wrap in while your things dry." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Katherine understood his concern, being alone in a cabin with a single woman, both of them in various states of undress, violated every social convention. But practicality had to prevail over propriety. Hypothermia was a real danger. "I'll change in the loft," she offered. "You can use the main room." "It's the sensible solution, Mr. Adams." After a moment, he nodded. Katherine gathered dry clothing for herself and a large blanket for Jax, then climbed the ladder to the small loft space. She changed quickly, hanging her wet dress on a nail protruding from a roof beam. "You can come down now," Jax called after several minutes. Katherine descended to find him sitting by the fire, the blanket wrapped around him like a cloak. His wet clothes were arranged on chairs near the hearth to dry. The sight of him barefoot, his hair damp and curling slightly as it dried, struck her as oddly vulnerable a contrast to his usual stoic self-sufficiency. "Thank you," he said as she joined him by the fire. "For the shelter. You've provided me with far more," she replied honestly. A blanket and fireside seemed small repayment. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. Katherine found herself studying his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his eyes reflected the dancing flames. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said suddenly, surprising her. Katherine gathered her thoughts. "It's a city of contradictions. Beautiful buildings and squalid alleys, great wealth and desperate poverty, culture and corruption." She paused. "I led a sheltered life there, I realize now. Protected from realities that couldn't be avoided here." "Why leave?" he asked, his gaze still on the fire. The question was direct, and Katherine found herself wanting to give an equally direct answer. "My father's bank failed. We lost everything: home, social standing, future." She swallowed hard. "My fiancé broke our engagement when he learned the extent of our financial ruin." Jax turned to look at her then, his expression unreadable. "His loss," he said simply. The words, coming from this man of few expressions, warmed something in Katherine's chest. "It was a fortunate escape, I believe now. William loved the idea of me, the banker's daughter with the right connections, not me as a person." "And your parents?" Jax asked. Katherine looked down at her hands. "My mother passed when I was young. My father, the disgrace was too much for him. He took his own life the night the bank closed." Saying it aloud still hurt, though the sharp edge of grief had dulled somewhat with time. Jax was quiet for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he reached across the space between them and briefly touched her hand, a gesture so unexpected and gentle that Katherine felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and she knew he understood loss in ways few others could. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's why this place means so much to me. It's my second chance. My only chance, really." The storm continued through the night, forcing Jax to remain in the cabin. Katherine insisted he take the bed while she made a pallet near the fire, overriding his protests with practical arguments about his larger frame needing proper rest. In truth, she slept little, acutely aware of his presence across the room. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world glittering in the early sunlight. The damage to the barn was significant but repairable. Jax assessed it with a critical eye while Katherine prepared breakfast. "I can fix it," he said as they ate. "Need some lumber from town, though." "I can't ask you to do more than you already have," Katherine protested. "You mentioned the cattle drive." "Not for 3 more days," he replied. "Time enough to get the barn weather-tight." Katherine studied him across the table. "Why are you doing all this, Mr. Adams? Truly? You've gone far beyond repaying any debt to my uncle." Jax seemed uncomfortable with the direct question. He looked down at his plate, then out the window before finally meeting her eyes. "You're facing winter in the mountains alone," he said. "Without preparation or experience." He paused. "Seen too many people die out here from lack of knowledge. Good people." His answer was practical, reasonable, yet Katherine sensed there was more he wasn't saying. But she nodded, accepting his explanation. "Then I'm grateful for your knowledge. And your kindness." A hint of color touched his tanned cheeks and he stood abruptly. "Should head to town, get those supplies." Katherine watched him saddle his horse, his movements economical and practiced. As he prepared to leave, she approached with a list she had written. "If you're going to town anyway, "Perhaps you could purchase these items for me," she asked, holding out the paper along with most of her remaining money. "I'll need them eventually, and it would save me a trip." Jax took the list, glancing over it before tucking it into his shirt pocket along with the money. "Anything else you need?" Katherine hesitated, then made a decision. "Information, if possible, about the Indian attacks Holt mentioned. I'd like to know what I'm facing." Jax nodded soberly. "I'll ask around, back by midday." True to his word, Jax returned before the sun reached its zenith, his horse loaded with lumber and the supplies Katherine had requested. As they unloaded together, he relayed what he had learned in town. "Attacks were last year," he explained. Cheyenne hunting party pushed off their traditional grounds by settlers. They were starving, desperate for food. He paused in his work. "Your uncle shot one of them when they tried to take his cattle. They returned 2 nights later, burned part of the barn in retaliation." "And the second attack?" Katherine asked. "Month later. Different group, but word had spread about the homestead being vulnerable. Army patrol happened to be nearby, drove them off before they could do more damage." He straightened, meeting her eyes. "No attacks in this area for 8 months now. Most tribes have been forced onto reservations further north." Katherine absorbed this information. "So the danger is past." Jax didn't sugarcoat his response. "Less immediate, but this is still frontier country. Best to stay vigilant." They spent the afternoon repairing the barn roof, working side by side as Jax taught her the basics of construction. Katherine proved a quick study, eager to learn skills that would help her survive independently. By evening, the structure was sound again, though cosmetically still rough. As they washed up for dinner, Katherine found herself watching Jax more intently than before. Over the past few days, something had shifted between them, a growing ease, a deepening connection that went beyond teacher and student. She realized, with a clarity that startled her, that she didn't want him to leave for the cattle drive. The thought of being alone in this wilderness without his steady presence made her heart constrict painfully. But she had no right to ask him to stay, no claim on his time or his future. He had already done far more for her than she could have expected from a stranger. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. It was their last night before Jax would depart for the Henderson Ranch, though neither mentioned this fact. "It's beautiful here," Katherine said softly. "I can see why my uncle chose this place." Jax nodded, his gaze on the distant peaks. "Changes with the seasons, gets in your blood after a while." "Has it gotten into your blood, Mr. Adams?" she asked. He considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "Reckon it has." "Yet you don't have a place of your own," Katherine observed. It wasn't a question, but Jax answered anyway. "Never stayed put long enough. Always another job, another trail." He glanced at her. "Until lately." Katherine's heart quickened at his words and the way his eyes held hers. "And now?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses broke the evening stillness. Jax was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun as he stepped in front of Katherine. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, Holt and his men from the trail. Katherine felt her stomach knot with fear as they approached the homestead. "Evening, Adams," Holt called, reining in his horse. "Miss Evans." He touched his hat in a mocking gesture of politeness. "Thought we'd check how you're settling in." "We're fine," Jax replied, his voice level but with an underlying steel. "No need for a social call." Holt grinned, revealing his tobacco-stained teeth. "Now, that ain't neighborly. We just came to deliver some news." He shifted in his saddle, his expression turning serious. "Army patrol spotted a war party 20 miles north, heading this direction." Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. "Indians?" she whispered. "Cheyenne renegades," Holt confirmed. Broke off their reservation last month, been raiding isolated homesteads. He looked directly at Katherine. Places like this. Jax's posture remained rigid. Why the warning, Holt? Didn't think you cared about the Evans place. Holt shrugged. Maybe I'm developing a conscience in my old age. When Jax's expression remained skeptical, he laughed harshly. Or maybe I figure if they hit here first, they'll leave my place alone. Either way, thought you should know. With that, he wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. Good luck, Adams. Miss Evans, you're gonna need it. As they rode away, Katherine turned to Jax, fear evident in her expression. Is it true? Are we in danger? Jax's face was grim. Could be. Holt's not known for honesty, but he wouldn't invent this kind of threat. He scanned the surrounding landscape, now deepening into twilight shadows. Need to prepare, just in case. The peaceful evening shattered, they moved quickly into action. Jax showed Katherine how to barricade the windows from inside, where to position herself if an attack came, how to use the shotgun he placed in her hands. I've never fired a gun, she admitted, holding the weapon awkwardly. Simple enough, he said, adjusting her grip. Point, pull the trigger, brace for the kick. He looked directly into her eyes. If someone breaks through that door who isn't me, don't hesitate. The deadly seriousness of their situation struck Katherine fully then. This wasn't Philadelphia with police on every corner. Here, survival depended on one's ability to defend oneself. What about you? She asked, noting that Jax was preparing to go outside. Need to get the horses into the barn. Secure the perimeter. He checked his pistol, then tucked a rifle under his arm. Bar the door behind me, only open it to my voice. For the next hour, Katherine waited anxiously inside the cabin, jumping at every sound. Through the window, she could occasionally see Jax moving around the property, setting up some kind of alarm system with cans and wire around the clearing's edge. When he finally returned, his expression was grave. No sign of trouble yet, but best to stay vigilant through the night. They established a watch rotation, Jax taking the first shift while Katherine tried to rest, then switching before dawn. Katherine found sleep impossible, her mind racing with fears and regrets. If only she had stayed in Philadelphia, found work as a governess or companion. But then she would never have met Jackson Adams. That thought troubled her more than it should have. When it was her turn to watch, Katherine sat by the window, shotgun across her lap, straining to see into the darkness beyond the clearing. Jack slept lightly near the fire, his gun within easy reach. As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Katherine's vigilance was rewarded or perhaps punished by movement at the forest edge. She squinted, trying to make out details in the half-light. "Jax," she whispered urgently. "Someone's there." He was beside her instantly, fully alert despite his interrupted sleep. He studied the tree line, then relaxed slightly. "Deer," he said, pointing to where a doe and fawn had emerged to graze in the dewy grass. Katherine felt foolish but relieved. "I'm sorry to wake you for nothing." "Not nothing," he corrected gently. "Good eyes, good instincts." He looked at her with something like approval. "You're learning." As full daylight arrived with no sign of danger, they allowed themselves to relax marginally. Jack still insisted on checking the perimeter regularly. But they also continued with necessary chores, feeding the horses, preparing food, organizing supplies. By midday, when no attack had materialized, Katherine began to wonder if Holt's warning had been false, perhaps a cruel attempt to frighten her. "You think he lied?" she asked Jax as they ate a simple lunch. Jax considered the question. "Possibly, but strange lie to tell." He set down his cup. "Army patrols due through here tomorrow. They'll have accurate information." "Tomorrow," Katherine repeated, suddenly realizing what this meant. "But you're supposed to leave for the Henderson ranch today." Jax met her eyes steadily. not leaving you alone until I know it's safe." His words sent a flood of warmth through Katherine, along with a sharp pang of guilt. "Your job'll wait," he interrupted. "Henderson knows where I am. Sent word this morning." Katherine didn't know how to express her gratitude without revealing too much of her growing feelings for this quiet, honorable man. "Thank you," she said simply, hoping her eyes conveyed what her words could not. They passed the afternoon making further improvements to the cabin's defenses, just in case. Jax showed Katherine how to create firing positions from different windows, established escape routes, and cached supplies in the root cellar as a last resort. As they worked, Katherine found herself watching him, the competent movement of his hands, the focused intensity of his expression, the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair. She was becoming attuned to his silences, learning to read meaning in the slight shifts of his posture or the furrow of his brow. Evening approached without incident, the day's tension gradually easing as the likelihood of immediate danger receded. They prepared dinner together, moving around the small kitchen space with a comfortable familiarity that belied their short acquaintance. As they ate, Katherine found the courage to ask a question that had been on her mind. "What happens after the cattle drive, Mr. Adams?" He looked up, seemingly surprised by the inquiry. "Usually find work for the winter. Lumber camp maybe, or head south to Arizona Territory." "You don't stay in one place," Katherine observed. Jax set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. "Never had reason to." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Katherine's heart beat faster as she considered her next words carefully. "And if you had a reason?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Their eyes met across the table, the moment stretching between them like a tangible thing. Katherine could see something in his gaze, a yearning that matched her own, held in check by caution and perhaps fear. Before he could answer, the warning system he'd rigged around the property jangled loudly, cans clattering against each other somewhere in the darkness. Jax was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he ordered, moving toward the door. "Bar it behind me." "Jax, wait," Katherine began, but he was already gone, slipping into the night like a shadow. Frightened but determined, Katherine grabbed the shotgun and positioned herself by the window, peering into the darkness. She could see nothing at first, then caught a glimpse of movement near the barn. Minutes stretched like hours as she waited, straining to hear any sound over the pounding of her own heart. When the knock finally came at the door, she nearly jumped out of her skin. "Katherine," Jax's voice called softly. "It's me. Open up." She hurried to unbar the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of him unharmed. But her relief turned to confusion when she saw he wasn't alone. A young Native American man stood beside him, bleeding from a wound on his arm. He was thin to the point of gaunt, his clothes tattered, his eyes wary but proud. "This is Two Feathers," Jax explained as he ushered the wounded man inside. "He triggered our alarm trying to reach the stream. He's alone, separated from his hunting party." Katherine hesitated only briefly before her natural compassion took over. "He's hurt. Bring him to the fire." As Jax helped the man sit, Katherine retrieved clean cloths and the small medical kit she had brought from Philadelphia. The wound wasn't severe, a deep cut rather than a gunshot, but it needed cleaning and bandaging. Two Feathers watched her warily as she approached. Jack spoke to him in a language Katherine didn't recognize, a few halting phrases that seemed to reassure the young man enough that he allowed her to tend his injury. "You speak his language?" Katherine asked in surprise as she worked. "Some Cheyenne," Jax replied. "Picked it up scouting for the army. Not fluent." As she cleaned and bandaged the wound, Katherine noted the signs of malnutrition in the young man: prominent ribs, hollow cheeks, the dull quality of his skin and hair. When she finished with the bandage, she immediately went to prepare food. Two Feathers ate ravenously when offered a bowl of stew, confirming her assessment of his hunger. As he ate, Jax attempted to communicate with him further, learning fragments of his story. His band left the reservation after their rations were cut. Jax translated haltingly. Government agents stole half their food allotment to sell privately. Children were starving. Katherine felt a surge of anger at this injustice. That's criminal, Jax nodded grimly. Common practice, unfortunately. Is his group the war party Holt mentioned? No, hunting party only. 10 men seeking game to feed their families. Jax exchanged more words with Two Feathers. They've taken no scalps, burned no homes, just hunting elk and deer where their ancestors always have. But settlers see them as a threat, Katherine surmised. Any Indian is a threat to men like Holt, Jax confirmed, especially armed ones. Two Feathers spoke again, more urgently this time, gesturing toward the north. Says there is a true war party, Jax translated, his expression darkening. Different band, Arapaho, 5 days' ride north of here. Army is tracking them. So Holt wasn't entirely lying, Katherine said. Not entirely, but the danger isn't as immediate as he claimed. Jax looked at Two Feathers thoughtfully. He wants to leave at first light, rejoin his hunting party. Katherine nodded her understanding, then had a sudden thought. The remaining cattle in the north pasture my uncle's herd, would they help his people? Jax looked at her in surprise. You'd give them your cattle? What good are a few cattle to me if I can help prevent children from starving? Katherine asked. Besides, I don't even know how to care for them properly. Better they serve a purpose. When Jax translated her offer, Two Feathers' reaction was initially disbelief, then profound gratitude. He spoke rapidly, his hands moving expressively. He says his people will remember your generosity, Jax translated. That not all white faces hide black hearts. Jax smiled slightly. Think you made an ally today? Two Feathers slept near the fire that night while Jax insisted on keeping watch. Katherine retreated to her bed but found sleep elusive, her mind replaying the interrupted moment before the alarm had sounded. What had Jax been about to say? What might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted? At dawn, Jax and Two Feathers prepared to leave for the north pasture, where the remnants of her uncle's herd, about a dozen cattle, grazed in a fenced meadow. Katherine insisted on accompanying them, wanting to see this gift delivered properly. The morning was crisp and clear as they rode, the mountains sharply etched against the blue sky. Two Feathers led the way, moving with the natural grace of one born to the saddle despite his injured arm. Jax rode beside Katherine, alert as always but more relaxed than he had been the previous day. This is a generous thing you're doing, he said as they crested a rise overlooking the pasture. Katherine shook her head. It's the right thing. Simple as that. His eyes held hers for a moment, warm with something that made her heart beat faster. Not everyone would see it that way. I'm not everyone, she replied softly. No, he agreed. You certainly aren't. When they reached the pasture, Two Feathers signaled to the trees beyond and 6 men emerged cautiously. There was a tense moment when the hunters first spotted Jax and Katherine, hands moving to weapons. But Two Feathers spoke rapidly, explaining, and the tension eased. The transfer of the cattle was accomplished efficiently, with Jax helping to herd the animals through the gate. The leader of the hunting party, an older man with graying braids, approached Katherine directly. Though they couldn't communicate with words, he pressed a small leather pouch into her hand, touching his heart in a gesture of gratitude. Inside the pouch, Katherine found a beautifully beaded amulet, a small piece of art representing hours of patient work. She was touched by the gift and smiled her thanks. As the hunting party departed with the cattle, Two Feathers turned back once, raising his hand in farewell. Katherine waved back, hoping their journey would be safe and the food would sustain their families. "You've made friends today," Jax observed as they watched the party disappear into the trees. "Might save your life someday." Katherine glanced at him. "Is that why you helped? Political calculation?" He shook his head slowly. "No, just seemed right." He looked at her directly. "Like you said." They rode back to the homestead in companionable silence, the morning warming around them. Katherine felt a strange peace settling over her, a sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing what she was meant to do. As they approached the cabin, Jax cleared his throat. "Army patrol will still come through tomorrow," he said. "I should stay until then, make sure everything's secure." Katherine nodded, hiding her pleasure at this extension of his stay. "That seems wise." They spent the day completing various small repairs around the property, tasks that would help Katherine through the coming winter. Jax showed her how to properly split and stack firewood, how to identify which wild plants were edible, how to set simple snares for rabbits. By evening, they were tired but satisfied with their progress. As the sun set behind the mountains, they sat on the porch together, savoring the cool evening air and the sense of accomplishment. "You'll do well here," Jax said suddenly. "Got the right spirit for it." Katherine looked at him in surprise. "Do you really think so?" He nodded, his expression serious. "Seen plenty of people try to tame this country, most give up when it gets hard." His eyes met hers. "You won't." The simple vote of confidence meant more to Katherine than all the flowery compliments William had ever paid her. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a great deal coming from you." Jax looked away, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice low. "Been thinking about your question from last night." Katherine's heart quickened. "Yes, about having a reason to stay somewhere." He stared out at the darkening landscape, his profile strong against the last light of day. "Never thought I'd find one after the war. Didn't think I deserved one." Katherine waited, hardly daring to breathe as he gathered his thoughts. "War changes a man," he continued quietly. "Did things I'm not proud of, carried that weight a long time." He paused. "Thought maybe that's why I kept moving, running from it." "And now?" Katherine asked gently. He turned to look at her fully, his eyes reflecting the first emerging stars. "Now I'm wondering if maybe it's time to stop running." The words hung between them, simple yet profound in their implication. Katherine felt a surge of hope so strong it almost hurt. "I think," she said carefully, "that everyone deserves a second chance, a place to belong." She gathered her courage. "Someone to belong with." Jax's expression softened in a way she had never seen before. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he reached for her hand. His calloused fingers entwined with hers, strong and warm. "Katherine," he said, her name sounding different in his voice than it ever had before. "I'm not a man of many words." "I've noticed," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. The corner of his mouth lifted in response. "What I'm trying to say is, these past days with you, they've meant something to me, more than I expected." Katherine squeezed his hand gently. "They've meant something to me too, Jax." He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "I have to leave tomorrow. After the Army patrol comes through, Henderson's counting on me for that drive." "I understand," Katherine said, though disappointment clouded her joy. "But after," he continued, his voice gaining certainty, "after the drive, if you'd be amenable, I'd like to come back." He paused. "To you." The simple declaration, so honest and straightforward, touched Katherine deeply. This wasn't William's practiced courtship, full of empty promises and social calculations. This was a man offering his true self, asking for nothing but the same in return. "I would like that very much," she whispered. "Very much indeed." In the gathering darkness, Jax moved closer, his free hand gently touching her cheek. Katherine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. When their lips met, it was gentle at first, a question, an offering. Then, as Katherine responded, the kiss deepened, becoming a promise between them. His arms encircled her, strong and protective, as her hands found their way to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both somewhat breathless, Jax rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since I saw you standing by that trail, looking lost but determined," he admitted. Katherine smiled. "Why didn't you? Didn't think a lady like you would want a rough cowboy like me," he said honestly. She touched his face gently, tracing the line of his jaw. "Then you don't know much about what ladies want, Jackson Adams." His laugh was low and warm, a sound Katherine realized she had rarely heard but instantly treasured. They stayed on the porch until the stars fully emerged, talking more openly than before, sharing hopes and fears, discovering the people behind their carefully constructed facades. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it the reality of Jax's imminent departure. They moved around each other in the cabin with a new awareness, their hands finding excuses to touch, their eyes meeting more frequently. The Army patrol arrived mid-morning, 6 uniformed men led by a lieutenant named Parker. They confirmed what Two Feathers had told them. A small band of Arapaho warriors had indeed broken from their reservation, but they were far north and moving away from this area, pursued by a larger military force. "You should be safe here, Miss Evans," Lieutenant Parker assured her. "But if you see any sign of trouble, fire 3 shots in quick succession. We patrol this route weekly." Katherine thanked him for the information, aware of Jax standing protectively beside her throughout the conversation. When the patrol departed, the moment she had been dreading could no longer be postponed. "I should head out too," Jax said as they watched the soldiers disappear down the trail. "Long ride to Henderson's. Need to be there by nightfall." Katherine nodded, fighting back unexpected tears. It was foolish to be so emotional he would only be gone a few weeks. Yet after the intensity of their time together, the prospect of separation felt almost physically painful. Jax saddled his horse while Katherine packed him food for the journey. When all was ready, they stood facing each other in the yard, suddenly awkward despite their newfound closeness. "I'll come back as soon as the drive is done," Jax promised. 3 weeks, maybe 4. "I'll be here," Katherine said, attempting a smile, learning to be a proper homesteader. He took her hands in his expression serious. "Be careful, don't take unnecessary risks. If anything happens, I'll fire 3 shots, she assured him. "But nothing will happen. You've prepared me well." Jack studied her face as if memorizing it. Then he pulled her gently into his arms, his kiss conveying what words could not: longing, promise, a depth of feeling neither had expected to find in this wilderness. When they parted, he touched her cheek one last time. "Take care of yourself, Katherine Evans. And you, Jackson Adams." He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, settling into the saddle with the ease of long practice. As he turned to go, he looked back at her once more. "I'll be back before the first snow," he said. "That's a promise." Katherine watched him ride away, his straight back and broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning sky. He didn't look back again, but just before he reached the bend in the trail, he paused. For a long moment, he sat motionless, as if gathering his thoughts or his resolve. Then he continued on, disappearing into the trees. The silence he left behind was profound, emphasizing how completely his presence had filled her days. Katherine stood in the yard long after he had gone, the warmth of his kiss still lingering on her lips, his promise echoing in her mind. Finally, she turned back to the cabin, her home now, truly hers in a way it hadn't been before. There was work to be done, preparations to make, a life to build. And in a few weeks, Jackson Adams would return, not as a chance-met stranger or reluctant teacher, but as something more, something they would discover together. The days without Jax passed more slowly than Katherine had anticipated. She threw herself into work, implementing all he had taught her and tackling new challenges as they arose. She repaired fence sections, tended the small garden she had started, practiced with the shotgun until she could hit targets consistently. In the evenings, she sat on the porch watching the sunset, imagining Jax on the cattle drive, wondering if he was looking at the same stars. She replayed their conversations in her mind, remembering the feeling of his hand in hers, the gentleness of his kiss despite his strength. The second week brought unexpected visitors, 2 feathers, and an older woman who introduced herself in broken English as Morning Sky, a healer. They brought gifts, smoked venison, wild berries, and medicinal herbs. Morning Sky showed Katherine how to use the herbs for various ailments and injuries, knowledge that would prove invaluable in this remote location. When Katherine asked about their hunting party, 2 feathers smiled broadly, indicating that the cattle had been a great blessing to his people. Through simple words and gestures, Morning Sky conveyed that the band was camped 15 miles north for the season, and Katherine should signal with smoke if she needed help. After they departed, Katherine felt less alone knowing there were friendly neighbors, albeit distant ones, watching out for her. As the promised 3 weeks stretched to 4, Katherine tried not to worry. Cattle drives were unpredictable, delays were common. But when the first light snow dusted the mountains, she couldn't help remembering Jax's promise to return before the first snow. That night, as she sat by the fire darning socks, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leapt, but caution made her reach for the shotgun before going to the window. In the moonlight, she saw a familiar figure dismounting a weary horse. Jax had returned, keeping his promise by the narrowest margin. Katherine flung open the door, rushing to meet him halfway across the yard. He caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of emotion. "You're here," she breathed when he set her down, her hands framing his face as if to confirm he was real. "I was beginning to worry." "Drive took longer than expected," he explained, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. "Then got delayed helping a family with a broken wagon outside of town." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "But I made it before the real snow." Inside the warm cabin, Katherine prepared food while Jax cared for his horse. When he entered, stamping snow from his boots, she noticed he carried his saddlebags more than would be needed for a brief visit. Seeing her glance, Jax set the bags down carefully. "Brought something for you," he said, reaching inside one bag. Wasn't sure if it was presumptuous. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Katherine accepted it curiously, untying the string to reveal a book, a beautifully bound copy of Tennyson's poems. "Oh, Jax," she whispered, running her fingers over the embossed leather cover. "It's perfect." He watched her, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. "Remembered you saying you missed your books. Town finally got a proper bookshop. Thought you might like something to read during the long winter nights." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. In Philadelphia, William had given her expensive jewelry chosen by his mother, never something that spoke to her own interests or desires. "Thank you," she said, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "I'll treasure it." As they ate dinner, Jax shared stories from the cattle drive, the ornery steer that kept wandering off, The young cowhand who couldn't cook anything without burning it, the spectacular lightning storm that had spooked the herd and caused a near stampede. "And Henderson?" Katherine asked. "Will you work for him again?" Jack set down his cup, his expression turning serious. "Actually, I came to talk to you about that." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Henderson offered me a permanent position, year-round work, good pay, cabin on his property." Katherine's heart sank. A permanent position would mean Jack's basing himself at the Henderson ranch, miles away. They would see each other occasionally at best. "That's wonderful," she managed to say, forcing a smile. "You deserve the security." Jack studied her face. "I turned him down." Katherine looked up in surprise. "You did?" "Why?" "Told him I had other plans." He reached across the table to take her hand. "If you're agreeable." "What plans?" she asked, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning. Jax took a deep breath. "This place needs more work than one person can handle. Barn needs rebuilding proper. North Field needs clearing for planting. Herd needs rebuilding." He met her eyes directly. "Been thinking about a partnership." "A partnership," Katherine repeated, her heart racing. "Between us," Jax clarified. "I've got savings. Not much, but enough to buy materials, some livestock. Got the skills to make this place profitable." He paused. "If that's something you'd want." Katherine's mind whirled with possibilities. "What exactly are you proposing, Jackson Adams?" A hint of color touched his cheeks, but his gaze remained steady. "Proposing we build something here, together, as partners in every sense." "Every sense?" she pressed, needing absolute clarity. Jack stood then, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair. Taking both her hands in his, he spoke with more words than she had ever heard from him at once. "Katherine Evans, I've spent 8 years wandering since the war ended. Never thought I'd find a place that felt like home again, or someone who'd make me want to stay. Then I found you on that trail, looking like you'd take on the whole frontier single-handed." He smiled slightly. "Knew you were something special right then." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. Been carrying it since I left Kentucky, waiting for the right person. Waiting for you, though I didn't know it." His eyes, so often guarded, were now completely open to her. "I'm asking if you do me the honor of becoming my wife." Tears filled Katherine's eyes as she looked at this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed it so completely. The ring he offered wasn't an expensive diamond like William's had been, but it carried something far more valuable: a history, a legacy, a future. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, Jackson Adams, I will marry you." His smile, rare, precious, and genuine, illuminated his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was pulling her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion this man of few words couldn't express aloud. Later, as they sat before the fire, plans unfolding between them, Katherine rested her head on Jax's shoulder. "When?" she asked simply. "Circuit preacher comes through in 2 weeks," he replied. "Unless you want to wait for spring, have a proper wedding in town." Katherine shook her head. 2 weeks sounds perfect. I don't need anything fancy, just you, this place, our future together." Jax's arm tightened around her. "Our future," he repeated softly, as if testing the words and finding them good. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Together, they prepared the homestead for winter and their shared future. Jax brought his few possessions from the room he had rented in town, including books that surprised Katherine with their variety and depth. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the scattered community. To Katherine's surprise, gifts began arriving: practical items from neighbors who understood the challenges of frontier life. A handmade quilt from the blacksmith's wife. Preserved fruits from a family whose wagon Jax had helped repair. a fine set of harness from Henderson, who had accepted Jax's decision with good grace. Even Holt appeared one day, bringing a bottle of whiskey and awkward congratulations. "No hard feelings about that warning," he said gruffly. "Just business, you understand." Jax had accepted the gift with a nod, his arm protectively around Katherine's shoulders. "Just business," he agreed, though his tone suggested the incident wasn't entirely forgotten. 2 days before the preacher was due to arrive, Morning Sky and several women from the Cheyenne camp appeared with a special gift, a wedding dress they had made for Katherine. The simple white buckskin garment was beautifully adorned with beadwork and fringe, representing hours of careful labor. "For new beginning," Morning Sky explained as Katherine accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. "Strong woman deserves good dress for new path." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the mountains gleaming with fresh snow. The preacher, a cheerful man named Reverend Johnson who traveled a circuit covering hundreds of miles, arrived mid-morning. With him came several families from nearby homesteads and the small settlement, eager to witness the union and enjoy a rare social gathering. Katherine wore the dress the Cheyenne women had made, her hair adorned with pine sprigs and the last dried wildflowers of the season. Jax, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a clean shirt and polished boots, waited for her on the porch that had been decorated with evergreen boughs. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows exchanged against the backdrop of the mountains that had brought them together. When Reverend Johnson pronounced them husband and wife, Jax kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes and cheers from their assembled guests. The celebration that followed was joyous, a feast prepared by many hands. Music from a fiddle player who had ridden 15 miles for the occasion, dancing on the packed earth of the yard despite the cold. As evening approached, their guests gradually departed, leaving the newly married couple alone in the gathering dusk. Jax built up the fire while Katherine changed out of her wedding dress, carefully hanging it in the small closet she and Morning Sky had constructed from salvaged lumber. When she emerged in her nightdress and robe, she found Jax standing by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. He turned as she approached, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Wife," he said softly, testing the word. "Husband," she replied, stepping into his waiting arms. Their first night together as husband and wife was a discovery of tenderness neither had expected to find in this harsh land. In the golden firelight, they learned each other fully at last, not just body to body, but soul to soul. Later, as Katherine lay in the circle of Jax's arms, listening to the steady beating of his heart, she thought about the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. The banking collapse that had seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of something far more precious than the life she'd left behind. "What are you thinking?" Jax asked, his voice a low rumble beneath her ear. Katherine smiled in the darkness. "That sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as disasters." He chuckled softly, his hand stroking her hair. "Wise woman I've married." "And I've married a good man," she replied, raising herself on one elbow to look into his face. "A man whose silence speaks volumes if one knows how to listen." Jax touched her cheek gently. "Never been much for words, but I promise you this, Katherine Adams, what I don't say with my mouth, I'll show you every day with my actions." "I know you will," she whispered, sealing the promise with a kiss. As winter settled fully over the mountains, the newly married couple established a rhythm to their days. They worked side by side, making improvements to the homestead even as snow piled high around them. Jax began construction on an addition to the cabin, a second room that would serve as their bedroom, giving them more space for the future they both envisioned. In the evenings, They would sit before the fire, sometimes reading aloud from Catherine's growing collection of books, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. Jax gradually shared more of his past, the plantation in Kentucky, where he'd grown up, the brutal realities of war that had changed him forever, the years of wandering as he sought redemption or oblivion. Katherine, in turn, told him about her sheltered upbringing, her father's ambitions, her own quiet rebellions against the strictures of Philadelphia society. They discovered that, despite their different backgrounds, they shared core values: honesty, hard work, a belief in second chances. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new growth to the land, they were ready. Together they planted fields, rebuilt the barn, and acquired a small herd of cattle and a flock of chickens. Katherine started a proper garden, using seeds she had carefully saved and knowledge gained from both books and neighboring women. On their first anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Katherine shared news that would change their lives once more. "I'm with child," she said simply, taking Jax's hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. The look of wonder that transformed his usually stoic face was something Katherine knew she would remember all her days. "A baby," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it untrue. Katherine nodded, her own eyes shining with joy. "Due in the winter. Our own little Christmas miracle." Jax pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For what?" she asked, drawing back to see his face. "For everything," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "For taking a chance on a silent cowboy who rode beside you when your trail seemed darkest. For hearing what I couldn't say. For giving me a home, a future, a family." Katherine touched his beloved face, tracing the lines that a year of happiness had softened. "The thanks go both ways, my love. You showed me strength I didn't know I had. You helped me build a life I never could have imagined." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in the comfortable silence that had become their language, a silence that spoke of love, commitment, and the promise of tomorrow. And when their daughter was born that winter night, with snow falling softly outside and fire crackling in the hearth, they named her Hope. For that was what they had found together on a dusty trail in the Colorado wilderness: hope, and a love that needed few words to be understood completely.